I'm Amanda Knox, and you're listening to Hard Knocks. Welcome to another episode of Old School. Today, we go back to my conversation with Greg Lukianoff. And just as a note, trigger warning, this episode does contain discussions of suicide. Greg Lukianoff is a First Amendment lawyer, the president of FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, and co-author of The Coddling of the American Mind and The Canceling of the American Mind. So here we talk a lot about CBT and recognizing cognitive distortions and how he used that in his own personal life, and it helped him to realize how those same kinds of cognitive distortions are affecting institutions and culture. And I think people will really enjoy this conversation because it isn't partisan. He argues that both the left and the right have developed incentives to suppress speech and the damage that has done to our democratic culture. Enjoy.
Amanda and I used to be card-carrying members of the ACLU, the organization that took the uncompromising position that free speech is an essential right and a bulwark to a healthy democracy. So strong was their commitment that, at one point, the ACLU famously defended the right of Nazis to demonstrate in Skokie, Illinois, a town home to hundreds of Holocaust survivors. They took on this case despite the vile views of the group they defended, and the hatred sure to come their way as an organization. The ACLU of today is much different, committed to a wide array of progressive causes, which sometimes come into conflict with their previously unequivocal commitment to the defense of free speech. But another organization has filled the void left behind by the ACLU. FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, is now the predominant defender of free speech in our country. We've watched with dismay in recent years as both the left and the right have become more comfortable with banning, limiting, and silencing speech, sometimes through legislation and sometimes through social norms. The problem is especially acute on college campuses, but it exists everywhere. A Cato Institute study from 2020 found that 62% of Americans do not feel free to speak their minds when it comes to politics. This is troubling for the health of our democracy, as open, honest debate and expression is crucial for arriving at the truth, for developing a shared consensus reality, and for political civility. Given all this, we're thrilled to have Greg Lukianoff join us. For Greg, as the president of FIRE and co-author of The Canceling of the American Mind, is one of our nation's foremost defenders of free speech. His journey to this place wasn't easy, on a personal level, but the depressive spiral Greg eventually transcended gave him insight into the problems plaguing our public discourse.
I was a weird lawyer who went to law school specifically to do First Amendment law, and specifically the freedom of speech protections. I took every class that Stanford Law School offered on First Amendment. Then when I ran out, I did an independent study of my own design on censorship during the Tudor dynasty to really make sure that I understood, how this applied to the printing press and that kind of stuff. I even interned at the ACLU of Northern California. And so when FIRE was very small, it found me to be its fifth employee. And so I started as legal director. I became president in 2006. Then we expanded beyond. We used to be the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, and we were just focused on threats to free speech in higher ed, which, as I think everybody knows by now, can often be quite severe. On June 6, 2022, we expanded our remit to the entire country. And we believe we are, and increasingly becoming, the leading defender of freedom of speech for people both on and off campus in the United States.
Yeah, that's interesting that there would need to be the founding of a new foundation for this, because typically, historically, the ACLU has been the foundation to occupy that space. Can you talk a little bit about why FIRE was founded in the first place?
Sure. A lot of us are ACLU people. I worked there. The co-founder of FIRE, Harvey Silverglate, used to be the president of the ACLU of Massachusetts. Nadine Strawson, the former president of the ACLU, the former executive director of the ACLU, Ira Glasser, I was on our advisory council. So a lot of us have ACLU connections. I have respect for the ACLU, but we do try to be different than them in a lot of ways. And among those differences is we only do freedom of speech. And I think that the ACLU having 19 practice areas can lead to tensions. I remember people making arguments that within the ACLU that we shouldn't be defending the rights of abortion protesters because that would interfere with their pro Roe v. Wade stance. And of course, us free speech people were like, no, it doesn't. You can perfectly say that you support the right to abortion, but you also support the right to protest. So we try to have a narrower focus. And one thing that really is important to me personally at FIRE is, and to us institutionally, is that we maintain a politically diverse staff. And there's lots of reasons for this, not the least of which is that it keeps you honest. Having a conservative in the room when you're a bunch of liberals, which oftentimes we are, really can kind of point out where your blind spots are and avoid straw manning and oversimplifying arguments. And what I love about the community we've been able to create at FIRE is that some of the hardest left people in the organization are the ones who are the most adamant that we need political diversity in the room if we really want to think through the issues we're dealing with. And the last one that also comes from our political diversity is we worked with the ACLU. They took a case called Vulo defending the NRA. And honestly, it was a pretty straightforward case. It was basically saying, New York took a lot of extraordinary steps to effectively defund the NRA, basically try to kick them out of the state of New York. And it was all very much due to their political speech, their advocacy for Second Amendment rights. Not a hard case. I'm pretty sure the decision came down as unanimous. And they asked us to be the leaders of their amicus coalition, which was great. But they did one thing that we would never do, which is they talk about launching the NRA case. And then in the following tweet, they completely throw the NRA under the bus. And again, I support gun regulation, but I would never in a million years basically say, my client, well, a total jerk. We defend this guy's free speech. I mean, total asshole, but just not something
we feel compelled to acknowledge the asshole that we are defending. We will defend him nevertheless. However,
we were joking within FIRE that given our actual political diversity and how we don't even agree on who the assholes are that we defend, that we should just default to all of our clients being assholes. Once again, asshole. We're not going to do that, just to be clear.
Here on Labyrinths, we talk with people about stories of when they have felt the most lost, either personally, literally, or metaphorically, and how they found their way again. And I was wondering if you, instead of just constantly talking about your books over and over, if you felt like discussing just something completely different of when in your life you have felt the most lost and you didn't know what to do or how to get out of it.
Oh, man. And actually, they're very closely related. The story of me being lost to the story of my books and to my life, frankly. I had issues with anxiety and depression since I was little. When I became president, when I moved from being legal director of FIRE to becoming president of FIRE, it was really hard. I had half of my staff quit on me because they knew that at least 3 of them I was probably going to fire because they weren't very good. And they brought some actually good employees with them. That was basically an effort to sink the organization. I can imagine you can relate to this. It's hard when there are actual people out there who are out to get you. It's a maliciousness that I hadn't previously experienced. So those first 2 years were really hard. And I was in the culture war all the time. I was also in Philadelphia, that's the headquarters of FIRE, but I feel very lonely and isolated there. And I had kind of a policy of maintaining some amount of professional distance from staff. So I was really, really lonely. I was going to my little Buddhist retreats. I started dating this girl, and she really did not approve of the fact that I was willing to defend Republicans. And I remember actually at one point saying, listen, I'm an old school ACLU guy. I'm willing to defend the rights of Nazis. I'm certainly willing to defend Republicans.
You know who you're dating, right?
Yeah,
I'm that guy.
Exactly. And her answer was, Republicans might be worse. Yeah. So that didn't last all that long. But also, on the other side, there were two different circumstances where I nearly got in fistfights with conservatives in bars in Philadelphia because they didn't like that we defended people on the left. I did have a really funny argument with a drunk right-winger guy who was trying to say that his family lost more to the Bolsheviks than mine did. And it's like, my grandfather fought in the Bolshevik Revolution. Like, we fled Russia because they would have killed us. So I was constantly getting it. Very alienating. Also got Lyme disease that year. I just had an awful 2007. And by the end of it, I get a little bit of a seasonal affective thing. And I got suicidally depressed. But I was really good at hiding it. And generally when I was at work, I could kind of hold it together. And then I'd go home to my lonely little isolated house. Much too depressed to tell anybody how bad I was doing, so I isolated myself, which sometimes happens when you're in sort of a depressed spiral, is you don't want to talk to anyone about it.
Right.
And I stopped cracking jokes. If my friends could have seen me, they would have been like, oh shit, that's bad. Like, Greg stops cracking jokes, he's in trouble. I took a kind of weak attempt at suicide once. I started reading all these suicide websites about like how you can do it. And in a weird way, I'm thankful to those suicide websites because they tended to be very explicit. It's like, listen, you can mess this up. Even if you shoot yourself, you can blow off part of your face and live. And so I was trying to come up with more or less a foolproof way to kill myself. I was going there to have multiple levels of redundancy. I was going to grind up all of my medication. I was going to have, metal thing around my neck. And God, I'm getting really explicit here. To make sure that I actually really did it. And I had a little glimmer of why. And when the answer in my head came back as something like, I really needed to, I have to do it now because I might recover. But that voice in my head, that future voice telling me I'm okay, would be a lie. And that therefore I have to do it now. I was sane enough that sounded a little messed up in my head.
Right.
So I called 911, and I got myself checked in West Philadelphia at a place called the Belmont facility. The kind of place where there's like a line on the carpet, and then they separate the people who are like drug addicted schizophrenics, who can't stop like howling, for example, from people who are just in a really, really bad way.
Yeah.
I managed to do this over a 3-day weekend.
Convenient.
Yeah. So staff didn't even know. I made one call to make sure that I'm going to be out on Monday, I'm going to be unreachable on Monday. It was incredibly dark time. When I got out, I just went back to work like nothing had changed. And meanwhile, I was just completely torn up inside. I was in the process of getting the board to let me move back to New York City, where I have friends and family. And so I got back to New York and I started to recover. But while I was recovering, I was studying cognitive behavioral therapy. Amazingly, I also found a doctor who lowered the number of drugs that I was on, seeing that as actually probably part of the problem, is that I was sort of over-medicated and with the wrong medication.
Unlike other forms of talk therapy, like psychoanalysis, which looks for subconscious meanings, cognitive behavioral therapy is problem-focused and action-oriented. The therapist helps the patient identify distortions in thinking that lead to conditions like depression and anxiety, and then to form effective strategies for modifying the behavior that will address these symptoms.
But when I was recovering, I was using cognitive behavioral therapy. And CBT is this amazing insight that essentially, when you're depressed and anxious, you have this internal self-talk that's filled with these exaggerations, that essentially you catastrophize, you engage in mind reading, that essentially if you go on a bad date, she was like, she hates my guts. She might, but that Christmas when I was with my family, I burst out into tears, or actually really tried to hide it, but I couldn't help it because I was sure I was not going to be alive the next Christmas. But when you're that far gone, you think things like, they'll be happy for me. Like, which is like how distorted your thinking gets. It's like, I even thought maybe my sister, who's a doctor, would help me figure out a way to kill myself. Which is like, that's how far gone you end up being. And then this is why when people judge people really harshly after they've killed themselves, I'm kind of like, dude, I was not in my right mind at that point. Like, you would not have recognized me. I barely recognized myself. But as I was recovering and learning cognitive behavioral therapy, this whole thing about talking back to your exaggerated thoughts, and of course, people, with my background, oftentimes have sort of a schema, an idea of who they are that might include words like broken. CBT is really amazing because sometimes people think you can just know it intellectually. No, that's bullshit. That doesn't work. I'm sorry, I'm swearing a lot. I don't know if this is a family show.
No, that's fine. I swear like a sailor. It's an ex-con thing.
But you have to do it. You have to do it basically every day. And when you have that really anxiety or depression promoting thought, what you do is you write it down. You get yourself in your prefrontal cortex a little bit, which has a calming effect to begin with. But then you look at the thought. I'm going to die alone because I'm a fundamentally broken person. You realize that's the immediate thought. And you're like, okay, is that catastrophizing? Is that mind reading?
A little dramatic.
Yeah.
A little much.
Yeah, exactly. So you use the power of sort of rational, not positive thinking, but just rational analysis of where you're coming from to start calming yourself down a little bit. And within 9 months, for the first time I could remember in ages, I was actually happy. When I started hearing these little angry, messed up voices in my head, I didn't believe them anymore. That they didn't sound persuasive anymore. And that was such a relief. Like, it was absolutely mind-boggling.
While Greg Lukianoff was going through this depressive period and climbing out with the help of cognitive behavioral therapy, he was also deep in the trenches defending free speech on college campuses. And certain things began to jump out at him.
I was looking at what was going on campuses, and I was kind of like, it seems like the adults are saying, do catastrophize, do engage in emotional reasoning, do engage in fortune telling, do engage in overgeneralizing. All of these ways of thinking that will make you miserable. And so I thought a lot about this kind of CBT theory of constitutional law. I didn't think about it too much again until right around the end of 2013, the beginning of 2014, because prior to that, students had been very skeptical of attempts to restrict freedom of speech. And then students started hitting campus in large numbers, and it wasn't subtle. It was like lightning struck. It was big, dramatic change. And they started showing up demanding speakers they didn't like be disinvited. And they also demanded new speech codes and trigger warnings and all of these things. But the rationale that they used was not, I don't want, the head of the International Monetary Fund coming to my school, not because she's a bigot or like whatever argument you're making. It's because it would be psychologically, permanently harmful to me, or more likely, usually they point to other people on campus. And I was like, they're doing it now. They're actually engaged in this sort of distorted thinking. And so I had just heard about Jonathan Haidt right around the time I was thinking about this. We'd actually had lunch one time, and I read Righteous Minds about understanding people on the right and the left a little better and the moral foundations they come from.
The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt is a book we will forever recommend to everyone. With a series of insightful metaphors, Haidt explores why well-intentioned people can disagree so vehemently when it comes to politics and religion. With the concept of moral taste buds and survey data from around the world, he shows that some people feel the moral foundation of loyalty or sanctity the way others feel the importance of fairness or care and harm. He also shows how much of our moral reasoning is meant to justify positions we hold for deep subconscious reasons, presenting the rational mind like a rider on an elephant, who can, at best, suggest a direction to the elephant, which mostly goes where it wants to, while the rider ends up delivering clever arguments for why it went that way.
And so the second time I went to lunch with him, we talked about this idea that I was making the argument that this new way of thinking that's hitting campus is going to be a disaster for academic freedom. It's going to be a disaster for freedom of speech, eventually off campus as well, because things that start on campus don't really stay on campus, particularly for the most influential schools. But also that it was going to be a disaster for the mental health of the young people who believe this way of thinking. And so even though I'd explained this to my staff, I got the reaction of like, okay, weirdo, cognitive behavioral therapy or a constitutional lawyer? Like, what the fuck are you talking about? So I got crickets from my staff. But when I told it to Height, I got I love this idea. Let's write something together. And of course I was like, yeah, like, you kidding me? You're like one of my heroes. And so even though we started in 2014, the article finally came out in the Atlantic in 2015, in the summer of 2015. And we solved the whole problem.
Yay, the end.
That article eventually became the book they co-authored, The Coddling of the American Mind: How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure.
First of all, I love that you have your own mental health disaster experience in order to inform this question, which ultimately a lot of people are discussing as a question of mental health. Like you talk about how these authoritarian forces, whatever they may be, they may be the mob, they may be the administration, they're coming in and saying, we're protecting people from certain speech or certain ideas because, as we know, certain ideas and certain speech, if things that we say to ourselves or things that other people say to each other, can impact our mental health. And we, as people who want to uplift people and not put people down, we want to encourage an environment that is uplifting to people. And therefore, we need to quash certain ideas. And you're pointing out that like, while the intention potentially could have been the right thing, they're actually going about it in this backwards, wrong way that's actually ultimately going to do more harm than just allowing somebody to come on campus and say a certain thing about a certain idea. Can you talk about that sort of like conflict? Because I think that's a crucial part of the disagreement about all of this, is like there's this feeling that those who protect free speech don't care about how people are emotionally impacted by the kinds of things that people say.
No, I care a great deal about it. There's some disagreement on what exactly this quote means. Life is pain. And I think it's the first noble truth in Buddhism. Now, there's some argument
it is, yes,
if it means something like life is unsatisfactory. And if that's true, I will stick with life is pain because it's really helped me a great deal. Because here's the amazing thing about repeating that to yourself sometimes. Then you realize that when you're in pain, you're actually just experiencing what it means to be alive. Someone who tells you, by the way, life isn't supposed to be painful, if you're experiencing it, there's either something wrong with you or something wrong with society that has to change. That is a cruel thing to tell somebody. And so the best you can do is get people prepared for living in the world as it actually is. There's actually a funny note here. I hate the titling Coddling the American Mind. I hated it when it was the 2015 article and we got the book deal. I'm like, no way are we naming this thing Coddling the American Mind. I'm not saying these kids are spoiled. That's not my point. So we sold the book under the title Disempowered, because that's more what I'm getting at, is that essentially it's like we're whispering into people's ears, into young people's ears, by the way, you'll be permanently harmed if you hear the wrong thing. You can't really handle life without support from outside. You don't really have all that much control over your life, and you're actually quite fragile and easily permanently injured. Don't be anxious. Kind of like have a nice day.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, that's messed up advice to give people. And it's also not true. The evidence is all really strong that people are highly resilient, that they can take challenges, that they can learn to disagree constructively. They can learn to not actually experience great deals of pain from what people say. That obviously, sticks and stones, the whole point of that little mantra is recognizing that words can hurt and trying to figure out ways to make them hurt less. And you bet, as kids who grew up with those kind of sayings, it helped to be kind of like, you know what, I'm strong, I have dignity, I'm not going to let your stupid insults hurt me. So the way we tried to get this across in the book, Coddling the American Mind, Disempowered, which came out in 2018, was a device that I'm pretty proud of. We call them the Great Untruths. And we have a setup in Coddling the American Mind where we go to a guru to get advice. And he proceeds to give us the worst possible advice you could imagine.
Okay.
And this comes in part from a tradition in my family. We're Russian-Irish folk, which you won't run into a lot of us. My dad's Russian, my mom's Irish. We're independent, pig-headed people. So we don't necessarily respond all that well to advice when you very specifically tell someone, do this thing. It's like, So we have a style in my family where we tend to give each other sarcastic advice, emphasizing what not to do. Like kind of like when my sister was angry about something, I'd be like, Alex, you should really fixate on that and really kind of push it up. And every morning, you think about that. And you get a laugh, and they're kind of like, yeah, okay, that would be the dumb thing to do. So giving people advice on what not to do is often the best you can do, but it also tends to stick with them. So we came up with 3 great untruths, and we came up with a 4th in Canceling of the American Mind. And those are, what doesn't kill you makes you weaker. Awful advice. Terrible to set the expectation that anything that hurts you is going to permanently harm you. The next one is, always trust your feelings, which sounds so nice, but it's just terrible advice. There's no wisdom tradition. It's kind of like, your feelings are always right. Like, no, they aren't. There's a great quote on this from Susan David, which is, feelings are data, not directions. And the final one is, life is a battle between good people and evil people, which is a wild oversimplification of human nature. I don't claim that evil people don't exist, but I tend to think that that's more of a psychological disorder combining sadism and sociopathy. And those people, thankfully, are fairly rare. And for the most part, people think they're doing the right thing. And I felt like for most of my life, we were getting more philosophically sophisticated, that essentially, like, suddenly our heroes in a lot of our stories were people who were very morally complicated. So I thought it was kind of a shock that it seemed like about 10 years ago, we started getting back to this sort of good versus evil. Good, smart, kind people like me, and the people I disagree with are obviously stupid, evil, or both.
They're racist, they're transphobic, they're yeah.
Exactly. And for canceling, we added a 4th, which is, no bad person has any good opinion. And that's to more point out the way, this really deficient way that we argue. You can win arguments by claiming, I don't have to listen to this person because they're bad, but it will never get you towards truth. Bad people sometimes have great opinions, and the person you like the most sometimes has really dumb ones.
Yeah, that reminds me to go back to the great truth of life is pain. My understanding of that sort of principle is that, and it goes back to something that you talk about in the Canceling of the American Mind, is there's this idea of life that is the life that we should be living, or the way that life should be, versus life as it really is. And oftentimes we get caught up in this idea of the way that the life should be. And when it comes into conflict with the way that life really is, then we inevitably feel pain.
Yeah.
Because we're just like putting ourselves in a situation where we can't exist in reality as it is, because we have this idea about how reality should be. And you write about how human beings have this innate desire to understand reality as it really is. And that's something that I can completely relate to, because I remember, sitting in a prison cell, really, truly wanting to understand why this was happening to me. And of course, I was getting a lot of different feedback about this, like, oh, my prosecutor's an evil person, or, oh, the whole entire Italian justice system is corrupt, or whatever it may be. And all of those things seemed so arch and therefore so not real.
Mm-hmm.
And I intuitively sort of understood that couldn't be the case, and that it couldn't be possible that there's this arch guy who's sitting in his office every day, waking up in the morning going, I'm going to put a little innocent girl in prison today. It just seemed so obviously wrong. And it put me down this path of trying to truly understand how, again, righteous mind, how people who are very wrong are thinking that they're doing the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
And what sort of cognitive dissonance is happening in their mind that is allowing them to have a skewed vision of what reality looks like because they're in their brain. Reality as it should be is I'm the good guy who doesn't get anything wrong, and therefore I must be right that this girl belongs in prison. I thought it was really, really smart of you to point out that, like, on an individual level, we as humans really care about how reality really is because it makes us more effective actors in the world. We can more effectively engage with the world when we actually are engaging with it as it is and not as it should be. At the same time, though, you point out that as a society, we also have this natural impulse to sort of interact with the world as we think it should be. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that tension and where you think that comes from.
Yeah, I think this brings us to the problem of ideology. One of the great lessons of the 20th century was the danger of ideology. Paraphrase Dostoevsky, ideology is more or less a way of trying to figure out the meaning of life in 10 words or less that kind of absolves you of your duty to think. And I think that the 20th century was a century of ideology, and we got to see how dangerous it was, whether it was, Maoist, Bolshevik, fascist, Nazi, supremacist, all of these things that were these wild oversimplifications of the world that people were willing to kill over as a way of maintaining some amount of symmetry in the world. And this to me is epistemically arrogant. It's attributing way too much to oversimplify the world to make it easier for you, but also to create a narrative in which you're the hero and everybody else is the bad guy. So, like what you were saying before, I think that if you come to the idea of what the world should be, but you don't care about the way the world really is, you end up in danger of falling for an ideology, which basically doesn't care about the way the world really is. No matter how many things didn't happen that, like Marx predicted, for example, they were never going to change their mind. They're going to figure out a new way to explain it away. Same thing with the Nazis. The ideology was the pure thing, and it was more important than people. Now, if you want to change the world and you start from the standpoint of, but first, I need to know what the world as it actually is, I'm all for you trying to make the world as it should be. But you have to start from that humble beginning. Because if you don't, if you start from an epistemically arrogant standpoint, you can do great, frankly, evil. Or you can do things that are just very cruel and thoughtless. Actually, and I wanted to ask you on this note, I assume that you've assumed that there were different motivations for different actors, of course, but why the hysteria around you? Do you think they really believed that you were guilty of this?
That's a really good question. I think that very early on, there were some cultural and linguistic misunderstandings between me and the investigators. There was also a lot of pressure on the investigators to rush to judgment. So they claimed to have been able to tell who was guilty or who was involved in the crime from the very beginning, that they used their own sort of cognitive behavioral analysis to examine the people involved, and they determined through that analysis who was involved in the crime and who wasn't. And so they pinpointed me, supposedly arguing that my behavior was not the behavior of an innocent person. And then I think the problem was that they then pushed me and coerced me into making a false admission of some kind, arrested me, and then when they've actually had the forensic evidence come back from the crime scene, and it did not point to me or any of the people around me, but instead to this local burglar that was known to be a person who broke and entered and everything, instead of admitting fault and admitting that they were wrong in the eyes of the international media, they instead just shifted gears and tried to cobble together a story where the person who was obviously guilty was involved, but also that I and the people that they had already arrested were also involved. And so they had all these puzzle pieces that they were working with that they assumed were all the correct puzzle pieces, and there was this huge chasm between them of how do these fit together, and they just sort of arbitrarily came up with unsubstantiated ideas. So a really good example of this is I had no relationship with the person who actually committed the crime. My boyfriend at the time also had never seen this person in his life. However, the prosecution came up with this idea that we were like a love triangle, and that these two boys were competing for my female attention, and so would do anything I told them. And therefore, I, the female, like arch female villain, orchestrated this like sex
American
orgy.
arch
Yes.
female.
Yes. I think that's also
We're
a
murderous
huge.
maniacs.
Yes. A huge factor was this idea of vilifying me through my sexuality and positioning, again, all these like arch characters where I was this arch demon. My roommate was this like pure virginal victim. And it was a nightmare. It's like so much to get into, but that's like a really crunched down version of everything that happened. It's a lot.
Well, it's interesting because in Canceling of the American Mind, we talk about free speech culture, like not just free speech law. And we try to kind of come up with and remind people of like little sayings that kind of indicate what free speech culture is about. And we go back to sort of older fashioned idioms that was, before your time, like it's a free country, everyone's entitled to their opinion, even things like don't judge a book by its cover, not my cup of tea. But one that isn't exactly a saying, but is really key to being part of a free and democratic society, but also as part of anything that involves truth seeking, is you have to always take seriously the possibility. Actually, you have to know with certainty you're wrong about a lot of things, and that you might be wrong about this. And it sounds like a lot of the people you were involved with just couldn't admit they could possibly have been wrong about something so serious.
I think that was a huge contributing factor, and it was devastating. It's funny, you talked about how like 2007 was like the worst year of your life, and it was a horrible year of my life as well. That's when I was imprisoned, and 2008, 2009, as the trial was going on, and this like insane false story that was being built up around this foundation of like Amanda must be guilty because we arrested her. I remember thinking like, the truth has to matter though, right? Like people have to like care about the truth, right? And I was very, very disabused of that reality when I was convicted and sentenced to 26 years, and I was 22 years old. On the one hand, we want to trust people to be given information and to make rational decisions or find rational conclusions from information.
Yeah.
But of course, we also live in a world of disinformation, of lies, of false narratives, and we know that human beings are prone to grasping onto ideas that affirm their pre-existing beliefs and are completely cherry-picking evidence as it fits them. So how do you reconcile that problem with the problem of censorship and telling and having this authority tell you what is the right view? I'm curious to know.
The Enlightenment in some ways made a mistake by patting itself on the back and calling itself the Enlightenment. Because really what the Enlightenment was the discovery of ignorance. Because it was more or less being like, you know what? If we test all of these pieces of folk wisdom we had, we're wrong about like all of it. Turns out, it makes intuitive sense that heavier objects fall faster than lighter ones, and it just took Galileo to actually measure it and be like, oh, actually, that's kind of weird. That doesn't seem to be right. It makes sense that time is absolute and that speed and gravity have no effect on it, but that's also not true. It turned out the world was much weirder than we thought, and that essentially the only way you could really know the world as it is to have a lot of rules about truth-seeking, because our biases are terrible. My idiosyncratic personal theory about freedom of speech, I call it the pure informational theory of free speech. And a key part of that is knowing what people really think and why. And this is something that it gets a little garbled in the discussion of things like misinformation. This is the example I would use. Lizard people who live under the Denver airport do not, in fact, control the world. Sorry to break it to you, Amanda.
What? What?
Lizzie?
My worldview. My
worldview. But knowing that your girlfriend, your uncle, that your senator thinks that they do is incredibly important information to have about the world in which you live. Most of what we talk about, most of what we believe is not about objective fact. It's about perception. It's about belief. It's about all these other things. And all of it is really important to know if you want to understand the world as it is. Massive conspiracy theories like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was absolutely a fraud, trying to make a story about an international Jewish conspiracy. Not true. Knowing that was highly influential at the beginning of the 20th century and people really did believe it was true, that's important knowledge to actually have. I have a theory on freedom of speech that is basically, there's no such thing as a free speech absolutist. We all believe that there are exceptions. But I'm pretty much an opinion absolutist, not because I think all opinions are good, and it certainly would be impossible to say that all opinions are true, but all opinions hold informational value at minimum about that person, but oftentimes about society itself. But when you get to the additional step of truth seeking, you need rules. And one of the most important points that me and my absolutely freaking brilliant 23-year-old co-author, Ricky Schlatt, talk about in the book is what we don't fully appreciate about cancel culture. And cancel culture, we knew that's the term not everybody loves, and actually neither Ricky or I are big fans of it, but we used it because when we actually looked at the polling, this is what most Americans, black or white, liberal or conservative, that's the term they used for whatever the hell started happening around 2014 and going into 2017 and 2020. And we defined it as the uptick in campaigns to get people fired, expelled, deplatformed, for opinions or speech that would be protected for, say, like a public employee under the First Amendment. Now, we do it that way so we can have a shorter definition, but also works in a lot of common sense. It doesn't mean that you can badmouth your boss anywhere and expect to still be hired, but it does generally mean that sometimes, you write an opinion piece, on your own free time. You usually, as a public employee, won't lose your job for that. So basically, kind of that's our definition of cancel culture. And in canceling, we try to do three things. One, show the data and indicate that, no, you weren't crazy. This really did happen. This really is happening. The numbers are astounding that they're actually on a historic scale. And I make this point a lot as a free speech history nerd. Part two is to try to get people to think of cancel culture a little differently. Think of it as a way of winning arguments without actually winning arguments, without persuading anybody, just scaring them out of having that opinion or getting them essentially moved off the board by getting them fired, and then scaring everybody else from ever saying anything like that. And we list it within all of these other ways that you can get rid of your opponent without ever addressing their actual argument. Now, all of these things, like in proper debate format, none of these ad hominem attacks, for example, are considered okay because, yeah, it's true. That jerk, that you went to high school with isn't always wrong. Like the fact that someone is a jerk doesn't mean they're wrong. The fact that someone's always nice doesn't mean they're right, like I said earlier. And if you want to have truth seeking, you have to really focus on the argument, not the person. You can't be, for example, distracted by your own inability to admit you were wrong and then make up some crazy story, which, by the way, I didn't actually know the love triangle thing since I heard that when I was younger. I didn't actually know that wasn't true. You don't make some fanciful story about American seductress just to not have to admit that you were wrong. So the rules are really important. But here's the thing that people don't appreciate about cancel culture. Every single time a professor gets in trouble or has a paper retracted or gets fired or forced out of, Harvard for having an opinion that is considered offensive, it completely destroys people's trust in the expert class. And I don't think the expert class really gets this.
Sure.
So I'm thinking here of Carol Hooven, who wrote a book called Testosterone. Wonderful book. Highly recommend it. She's a very compassionate person. She was on an interview talking about how we should be compassionate towards trans people, that we should use their pronouns, but we shouldn't pretend that biological sex is not a real thing.
Right.
And that's what led to a campaign to punish her at Harvard. And that's eventually what led to her leaving Harvard. And I'm like, guys, Okay, first of all, this is very sad for Carol. I love Carol Hooven. Again, very thoughtful, very much on the left as well. So that was sad for Carol. That was also really terrible for Harvard, because Harvard should have had her back, and very publicly so, and that was embarrassing for them. But it was even more devastating to people's trust and expertise, particularly on this topic. That essentially, it's like, wait a second, someone saying biological sex is real can get kicked out of Harvard.
Right.
I don't believe you on anything anymore. Like, if that's the consequence, the next person, when Scientific American comes around and says, no, actually, it's not, it's a societal construct. It's like, no, we know that there's a major consequence for saying anything other than that, so we're not going to believe you. And that's if it happens once. We talk about, well over 1,000 examples of professors being targeted for speech that in some cases is stuff that was utterly tame in the rest of the country. And when you see these plummeting numbers of respect for expertise and respect for trust, cancel culture is part of that. And what the real secret insidious effect here is, it leads to a situation in which it's very hard to have a universe of shared facts that anyone trusts. And that's dangerous.
Getting into this idea of deplatforming, cancel culture, as you've defined it within the book, is, deplatforming, removing people from certain positions because they have an offensive opinion. But I think even today, another problem with free speech culture is this refusal to platform certain ideas or certain people. So it's not that they've been invited and now they're no longer invited. It's now that they're just blanket non-inviting any ideas, not even arguing that they're necessarily offensive, but that they're irrelevant, and sort of making the case that it is not in the public interest to hear this opinion or that opinion. And I'm wondering about your feelings about that filter, because there is necessarily a filter. Like, anybody who is putting on an event has to think, what is going to be in the interest of the public that is potentially going to come to this event. There is a filter that goes in. Typically, we want someone who's authoritative on a subject or has an interesting opinion that we think people will learn from, or someone like me, someone who has a podcast, who's inviting people. I'm not just going to invite any random person onto my podcast. How do I decide what is of interest? And what do you say to those people who would argue, well, certain opinions are just simply irrelevant now. They're obviously wrong, and therefore they don't deserve to be platformed in the first place.
Sometimes First Amendment people are accused of overusing John Stuart Mill, but there's a simple reason for that. He's a freaking genius. The guy spoke Greek at 3. His work on freedom of speech is just absolutely brilliant. I'm going to slightly misquote it, but, he who only knows his side of the argument knows little of that. And so I would end a lot of speeches for a long time, with basically homework for people who came to my talks, saying, think of it as an intellectual duty to talk to smart, implicitly well-informed people with whom you disagree. And there are plenty of them. And the extent to which, when you allow people in the expert class, whether it's academia or journalism, to simply get rid of entire categories of argument by just making it taboo to talk about them, you shouldn't be surprised that suddenly the sphere of taboo gets bigger and bigger and bigger.
Well, before I let you go, I just wanted to open up the floor. Any thoughts you want to share, how people can reach out to you or follow you?
Well, I'm a big fan of yours, so if you ever want me back, I'd be happy to come chat. In terms of what we do, definitely please consider supporting FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. We want to be the nation's premier defender of freedom of speech. And we need support. We need people, not just donors. We need people to get out there and stand up for freedom of speech from a principled, nonpartisan standpoint.
Thanks for listening to this old school episode from the archives. And please subscribe at amandaknox.substack.com to get ad-free episodes of Hard Knocks, subscriber-only essays, live video hangouts, and more. Subscribers can also submit questions for my Ask Amanda Anything episodes. Don't be shy, really. You can ask me anything. Again, that's amandaknox.substack.com. Hope to see you there.